But a lot of people, kind of like what Chris just described, just kind of submit themselves to other people's semantic circuits or semantic models, and never really become good at never really master circuit 3. So I think when you do master circuit 3, it's very easy to feel like to become egotistical about it, like to develop an ego, like, oh, I'm so smart, I'm so clever, I have such good ideas, look at me, I'm at circuit 3. When really it's like you're standing on like the third of an 8-stage process. You are tuning in to The Multiversity, a podcast for higher dimensional education.
Join us as we explore philosophy, science, history, and the great unknown.
Welcome to The Multiversity. Today we're going to be talking about the 8-circuit model of consciousness. This is a model of consciousness that comes from the 1960s and 70s. It's developed by Timothy Leary and popularized by Robert Anton Wilson. So we read the book Prometheus Rising to prepare for this episode, and we're going to do a brief discussion of hot takes, what our hot takes were of that book before getting into our discussion of the circuits. I'm Ariel, and what did you guys think of Prometheus Rising?
Hey everybody, I'm Katie. I thought it was pretty awesome. That book was a head trip, for sure. I would highly recommend that anybody read it. I didn't agree with everything in the book, especially as we get to the later circuits, which we'll talk about later. But all in all, I thought it was a really interesting guide, almost like a psychedelic self-help book on how to reach higher states of consciousness.
Hello, everyone. I'm Chris. I also enjoyed Prometheus Rising. I thought it was probably one of the maybe 10 or 20 best books I've ever read. It's one of those books that kind of tries to explain everything and explains all of history and all kind of human conflict, like where we've been, where we are, and where we're going in terms of psychology, in terms of these 8 circuits of consciousness. And I thought that Wilson really kind of ties everything together in a neat little package. And so I'm excited to see where this conversation goes.
Hi, I'm Kurt, and this book is pretty wild. Yeah, so it starts off talking about things that are kind of accepted, like ideas from Freud, like the oral stage, and things like that are accepted parts of psychology. But as you get further into the book, it gets wilder and wilder till it's talking about how your consciousness relates to the universe or something like that. So it's very interesting.
Cool. Thanks, guys. Full disclosure, this was not my first time reading this book. The first time I read it was back in 2016. And I actually read it after the Trump election. And it really encouraged me to look at things through perspectives that before that I'd kind of just dismissed from the outside. As part of the idea of the book is to be able to put your perspective into multiple different, what Wilson calls reality tunnels, which we'll get to in a sec. So this book really helped me broaden my way of thinking and transcend my ideological tunnel I was in before. So let's dive right into the circuits. Before we do that, we have 2 concepts we need to define. The first concept is the concept of reality tunnels. So Robert Anton Wilson talks about this a lot. A reality tunnel is a perspective on reality that people live within. So examples of reality tunnels are feminism, Marxism, Nazism, Protestantism, Orthodox Judaism. And when you're in the reality tunnel, the world presents itself to you in a certain way, and you experience the world in a certain way, where you have the ability to communicate better with people in your own reality tunnel, and it can be challenging to communicate with people outside of it. The second concept we need to talk about is the concept of circuits themselves. So in the 8-circuit model of consciousness, there's Timothy Leary lays out 8 circuits, which Robert Anton Wilson expands on. Each circuit represents a kind of imprint of reality and provides a certain experience of reality. Now, reality tunnels and circuits are different. reality tunnels draw from the circuits, but they often draw from multiple circuits. They're not just, they don't map one-to-one onto each individual circuit. Now, this may sound a little bit jargony, but I think it'll be a lot more clear once we get into our discussion, so bear with us. So we're going to start with circuit 1, the oral biosurvival circuit. Chris, do you want to tell us a little bit about it?
Sure, Ariel. So the first circuit is called the oral biosurvival circuit. It is the oldest circuit in consciousness or in life. It pretty much developed around the same time that life did, about 3.4 billion years ago, according to Wilson. It is associated with nourishment, physical safety, comfort, survival, suckling, cuddling, etc. So with the first circuit, if you have a positive imprint, then you get this general attitude of trust towards the world. And if you have a negative imprint, then you get this sort of general attitude of suspicion towards the world. And what the biosurvival circuit does is it tells you, it's basically pleasure and pain. It's basically, you know, is this something that I need to approach, or is this something that I need to avoid? Is this, you know, do I move forwards, or do I retreat? Do I advance or retreat? And so the way that this circuit is imprinted is by the mother. Okay, so how did you guys understand this circuit?
It seems to me that this circuit pretty uncontroversially exists. Like, you see even behavior in bacteria where they have approach and avoid behavior. And as we talked about in our plant consciousness episode a couple weeks ago, we see this behavior in plants too. Like, they'll grow towards positive stimuli and grow away from dangerous or undesirable stimuli. So it seems like this circuit definitely exists. And I think where it becomes interesting is where it manifests in human behavior and human culture.
I was going to say, I agree that this circuit exists. It seems pretty uncontroversial that people have a survival instinct and an instinct to go towards nourishment, and specifically nurturing and mothering. And as we had said, it kind of touches on some Freudian ideas about like oral fixation, especially very early on in life. And we know from basically any study that's been done on early childhood development and how things are impacted later in life, that like those early, you know, first 2 years, your relationship with your mother or mother figure is extremely important to how you develop. So I think Robert Anton Wilson kind of hit the nail on the head with this. This is like our most base, our most base instinctual circuit, if we want to call it that.
Yeah, he talks about this circuit being timeless, where whenever a human being finds themselves in a threatening situation, where this circuit is active, basically, you don't really think about your reaction. It's so, you know, deep in your psyche that you just unconsciously react, basically, to threats or alternatively like promises of pleasurable experience.
Yeah, and it's interesting because the circuit also determines what we consider to be threats and how we respond to them. Like Robert Anton Wilson kind of talks about, like, depending on how the circuit is imprinted, the person will grow up to kind of consider the world to either be a fundamentally dangerous place or a fundamentally safe place for exploration.
I did want to talk a little bit about this idea of imprinting. I think that your early experiences are really important, but when it comes to imprinting of this circuit, like there's some imprinting or some effects that go on even before you're born, before your like breastfeeding experience or before your motherhood experience. If you are growing up in a womb that is bathed in stress hormones, then you're more likely to perceive the world as dangerous, even as an adult.
Well, one thing I'm thinking about is how it relates to the oral stage. So people are very focused on eating or smoking, and it's supposed to be based around suckling the mother's breasts. It's like that feeling of comfort, and that's why people maintain those behaviors.
Yeah, and it's interesting because Robert Anton Wilson suggests that people who have like a very like babyish body type, like people who are like it's controversial, but he kind of suggests that people who are like overweight or have like softer bodies might be some kind of negative imprint on this circuit. So it almost, I don't know. What do you guys think of that idea?
I think he says that this is the viscerotonic body type that you're talking about, and I think that doesn't just happen in Wilson's view if you have a negative imprint, but just if you use this circuit in a dominant way, sort of more than the other circuits.
So I think it comes out, a lot of these things come out in our language. So we hear things like comfort food. So people want to be comfortable, they're seeking comfort, and they go towards that oral stage and they eat a lot of stuff. So there's that.
I think in some cases that's true. I think it's kind of not socially acceptable to say, but I think that a lot of times when people are really overweight, it's because maybe they have like a dysregulated system of comforting themselves, and so you go to like these very base things like comfort food, and that it's not just about overeating. There's other forms of pleasure-seeking behaviors.
Another thing that Wilson talks about is like the circuits associated with opiates. And it's interesting because like opiates, of all the drugs, they have the most like, they're the most comforting, right? Like they take away all pain.
Yeah, I had a friend who had struggled with opiate addiction. And basically what he described is it felt like love and comfort and a warm embrace and took away all the worries in the world.
Right, exactly. It almost places you back into the womb in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
You got that like, whoa.
Yeah, there's like an intense irony there, right? Because there's like a thing where like if you do a drug that gives you something a lot, you start to have a hard time producing that thing yourself. Mm-hmm. So it's like if you become addicted to cocaine, like cocaine makes you feel amazing. So you're like, you start to be unable to feel amazing by yourself, but it's still potentially, you can still function that way. Whereas with opiates, they make you feel comfortable. And probably people who have a hard time feeling comfortable already are drawn to them. And then when you take away the opiates, suddenly they can't feel comfortable at all, ever. It's almost like this like hellish thing to imagine.
Yes, exactly. Another thing that Wilson points out is that so after you imprint with your mother, then your biosurvival circuit kind of hooks onto a gene pool or a community that you come to for comfort. And since he says that we've evolved past just the pack bond, and we have these large societies where money takes the place of the pack bond. So when you have a job, that's very comforting. And if you get fired, then that's kind of equivalent to ostracism or exile, and it can be very terrifying. And it kind of puts you into this very like primitive fight or flight state.
In our society, our jobs are our method for survival. That's how we get our food. That's how we meet our basic needs. It can be everything.
Anyone have anything else to add? Did you imprint this circuit properly?
I don't know. Sometimes I have my doubts. I do have a sweet tooth.
My impulse is to say I did imprint this one properly, but I actually have a sweet tooth too. And I did notice, like when I stopped eating sweets, like it wasn't just like a physical desire for them that persisted. It was like an emotional desire. Like I felt like sadness because I wasn't going to have the sugary things anymore.
Mm-hmm. I would say that I think I imprinted it properly. I definitely also have a sweet tooth and will go to food for comfort sometimes, but I don't think that necessarily means that we didn't imprint it properly. I think those are instincts that we go to, and if something's way out of whack, then that might point to an improper imprinting. But I think I was lucky to have a very stable, kind of blissful early childhood experience.
I think I also imprinted this one properly. I've always been kind of an explorer, and I think one of the features of somebody who's imprinted this properly is they feel like a kid that feels safe, is that they feel safe to explore. They feel safe to go into the unknown and just see what's out there.
But perhaps looking back, I was an extremely anxious kid, and I felt very unsafe to explore or even watch movies that were rated PG or go in the backyard unsupervised or things like that. My parents had to push me to do normal things.
I think that might be related more to your circuit 4, though.
Maybe.
Which we'll get to.
We'll get to that, yeah.
Do we want to maybe talk briefly about what healthy expressions of circuit 1 might look like? Because the idea is they should all be integrated, right? Like it's not, there's bad circuits and good circuits, but they all play a role.
There are these parts where Wilson talks about the baby functions. He talks about playing with one's own body, playing with other people's bodies and the environment. And the playfulness is supposedly part of Maslow's idea of a self-actualized person. So I think that's an important point.
Yeah, absolutely. If you're comfortable playing with your environment and yourself and others, then I guess that could definitely be seen as a sign of successful imprinting of the first circuit.
I mean, here's something I've been wondering. Do you guys think there's like a role for like indulgence, like sugary foods and stuff like that?
Yes.
Yeah, I think yeah. Go ahead.
I think so. I think there's a role for indulgence. I think there's a role for self-soothing. I think no matter how healthy or well-adjusted we are, people are definitely going to go through hard things. And I don't think it's necessarily unhealthy to use a coping mechanism or a comfort mechanism sometimes, as long as it doesn't get out of hand.
Yeah, it depends on the situation. I remember one day I was very stressed and I was like, I'm just going to eat this, half a chocolate cake or whatever it was. And it didn't help. And it wasn't, I tried some other mental techniques and it eventually settled me down. But that was, in some situations, maybe it's a good strategy, but when the stress is more extreme, that can be a problem.
Yeah, I almost wonder, like, if delinking it from stress, because I'm like doing this thing where I'm trying to go 66 days without eating sugary snacks. But I'm wondering after, like, whether to reintroduce them, but in a way that's not linked to like self-soothing or like, at least I have this sugary thing, even though I feel sad kind of thing. Like maybe having it be more like a joyful thing. Like I'm going to go out for an ice cream cone with someone or something.
Yeah, I think it's important to have, as we grow up and become adults, a sort of a knowledge of ourselves, which allows us to comfort ourselves when we're feeling down. Like when you're a young kid and you're feeling bad, a lot of times you don't really know why you're feeling bad, and that's when your mom can really help out because she probably knows. But as you get older, hopefully you explore your environment, you get to know yourself, you get to know your needs, and you figure out how to meet those needs. And so, sugary foods can be sort of a coping mechanism when you don't really know what the problem is. And I think the same thing could be said for drugs. You're uncomfortable, but you don't really know why you're uncomfortable. And so you just have this hole, this emotional hole in yourself. And so you're trying to fill it, in any way that you know how. And so sugar is a good way to do that, or opium is a good way to do that. But of course, the correct solution is to actually find the problem and fix it.
Right. It's a crutch in a pinch.
Yeah.
So I wanted to bring up one more thing. We've been kind of coding certain behaviors as healthy or unhealthy. And I do think some behaviors are healthy or unhealthy, but we were saying things like feeling safe to interact and play in your environment is a healthy, positive, successful imprinting. And I was kind of questioning that and thinking, Well, there are a lot of environments that are unsafe, and I don't think it's unhealthy to feel unsafe in your environment if your environment is unsafe. So maybe because all of us grew up in safe environments, the healthy and successful imprinting was for us to imprint and feel this sense of safety and exploration. But the adaptive thing to do in an unsafe environment is to feel unsafe and to feel very anxious. So I wouldn't code that as unhealthy. I would almost say that a successful imprinting in a dangerous, stressful environment is to feel unsafe.
Yes, so it's like adaptive to your environment. So like when a mother has a lot of cortisol or a lot of stress when the baby is in the womb, the baby will tend to grow up more aggressive. And that's just adaptive to the environment because the stress is sending the signal like, hey, the world is a harsh place. You got to be tough out there. And that's how it responds.
It's interesting because it can be maladaptive in both directions. I think probably as like Westerners, it's more common to see people who are like in the like unsafe defensive mode, like in a way where they might be more successful in a more open exploratory mode. But it's also like you hear those news stories about like backpackers from Florida or whatever who like go backpacking in Central Asia when there's in the middle of a war zone and they get killed by ISIS or something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think your DNA, as Katie was saying, has a good strategy here. You know, if your parents can't protect you from feeling stress when you're a little kid, then you're going to need to grow up tough so that you can face whatever challenges your parents are facing.
Hey guys, you ready for Circuit 2?
I think we're ready.
Let's do it.
Okay. So where Circuit 1 is interested in issues of safety and survival, Circuit 2 is all about dominance. Circuit 2 is imprinted in toddlerhood. It's more associated with the father, where Circuit 1 is more associated with the mother. And Circuit 2 can be imprinted to code the person either as dominant or as submissive. It's associated with territoriality. Robert Anton Wilson believes it's common to all mammals. And he also links it to Freud's anal stage, having to do with potty training and the power struggle that takes place around there. So, how do you guys understand Circuit 2?
I think this circuit is very prominent in human, in the structure of human societies and in sort of things in the news. And I think the vast majority of people spend probably most of their time kind of in or around this circuit. You know, this is the circuit of status. You know, are you an alpha male or are you a bottom? You know, what is it? The runt of the litter. Are you going to eat first or are you going to eat last? Or are you somewhere in the middle? That's all I have to say.
I think the idea of this circuit is a bit more controversial. A lot of people don't want to think that we have these kinds of dominance hierarchies, or it's when you talk about alpha males or beta males in a human context, a lot of people will kind of balk at that. I think from observation, though, it's very real. I mean, I can remember even as a kid in elementary school, people were very aware of social rank at all times. If you asked any given person who is the most popular girl in school right now or who is the most popular boy in school right now, everybody would give you the same person and they would know exactly where they stood. And it was completely unspoken. Like nobody told you where your rank is. I guess people would kind of discuss it in rumor from time to time, but everybody had that sense.
I don't know if it was ever so clear for me in high school. Like I knew some people were more popular, but it wasn't like I could always say that person is the most. So I'm not so sure about that.
Yeah, I was going to say that too. Like I think that for me, I had a similar experience as Kurt, where I kind of didn't really know who was popular, and that might be just because I spent a large portion of my childhood kind of away from other kids, and so Kurt, maybe you had a different thing going on, but But for me, I was just like, I think that person's popular, and I think I'm like reasonably popular, but I'm not sure. And I think a lot of it has to do with whether you decide to play the game or whether you decide to just kind of, have your own little like parallel game over here. And people just kind of ignore you, which probably means that I was close to the bottom of the hierarchy in reality. But yeah.
Well,
That
maybe you're
dynamic
just
is
playing a different game.
Yeah, I want to say it became less rigid as we got older. It was especially rigid in maybe 4th through 7th grade or something like that. And then kids cooled down a little bit. It was interesting too, because popularity is the word that we used. And I think it was the word that a lot of people use in English speaking societies for when you're talking about the cool kids in school. But it was really about social rank, not about popularity. It wasn't about how many friends you had. It was about which friends you had. And it was about, are you part of the friend group that doesn't ever get picked on? Or if they do, that doesn't care because you're being picked on by people of lower rank or whatever. It's so strange to think back about that, but it's very animal. It's very dominant, submissive kind of stuff.
Yeah, in my school, it was kind of like the seniors were at the top. In my high school, like the seniors were at the top of the hierarchy, and the freshmen were kind of at the bottom of the hierarchy. And when you're a boy, and you're a freshman, you usually like have a high voice because you haven't gone through puberty yet. And then sometime in the course of high school, your voice gets lower and you get bigger and more muscular, and so mostly it's like seniority in high school for an all guys school, which is where I went. But I also think that my school had like a pretty reasonable like disciplinary staff. Like the kids were reasonably well behaved, I guess, because you could complain to the administration if somebody was bullying you and stuff. So it's almost like the administration was the top of the dominance hierarchy, and then it was like seniors and then juniors and then sophomores and then freshmen, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, you bring up an interesting point with the anti-bullying stuff, Chris, because I mean, one thing that's a little bit grim about what Katie's saying, like I think in our society, we like to believe that these dominance hierarchies are a product of the way people are socialized, the effects of capitalism, parenting, environmental factor. And that's kind of the basis for a lot of this anti-bullying stuff, like this idea that we can eradicate bullying in schools and have it be more egalitarian. And what Katie's saying would almost suggest that maybe we can alleviate it a bit, but that eliminating it is a pipe dream.
I'm really not sure. It seems like things are less severe than they used to be. Like the kinds of situations that my parents describe, or the kinds of situations that my friends describe who grew up in rougher areas, are way more intense or on a different level of intensity. Like at my school, we still had very much this dominance ranking, if we're going to call it that, but there wasn't really hardcore bullying, at least that I was aware of. And I was very, very low on the dominance hierarchy. So I feel like I would know if there was hardcore bullying. It was just kind of this vibe that you got from people that they thought that they were better than you or something like that.
You know what it makes me think of? It makes me think of like Spider-Man. It's like when Spider-Man originally came out in like 1963 or whatever, like Flash Thompson was like a traditional bully who would like pound him in the locker and stuff. But like in the newest version, like Spider-Man Homecoming, they instead made him a nerd who would just make like belittling comments to like indicate that he was like above Peter in the dominance hierarchy and that Peter was like a fool. And so it's kind of interesting because it shows like the cultural evolution of bullying through the ages.
Yeah, one thing that I've noticed now, especially with younger kids, like friends, little siblings and stuff like that, is kids have been socialized to be so inclusive that it's almost become, in some schools, it seems like it's almost a status symbol to be inclusive. Like you raise your own dominance if you're like overtly, almost conspicuously nice to kids who are overweight or kids who are disabled or things like that. But it still has that vibe of maybe not total authenticity. So I think we are evolving.
Yeah. I remember I had the opportunity to teach in a Thai classroom, just a couple of classes. And I thought it was so funny because I was trying to explain some concepts, and I said, "Oh, can I get a volunteer from the class to come up and help me so people will understand this better?" And people were like, "Oh, is this kid? He's the best. He's the smartest. He knows so much English," and he got up to the front of the class. So it was like, when I was in school, I don't think it would have happened like that. He was a bit bashful about it, but everybody was kind of proud of him. Like they liked him for being intelligent and that sort of thing. So it wasn't like he was a nerd or like excluded or anything like that.
So I think the dynamics of the social hierarchy can be affected mostly by who's at the top of the hierarchy. If the person at the top of the hierarchy is a nice person and inclusive, then that kind of imprints everybody with that behavior. Whereas if the person at the top of the hierarchy is mean and, insulting people and beating them up and just generally being a dick, then that kind of imprints everybody the other way, where that's seen as the dominant behavior. So definitely the sort of the dominance imprint of a particular hierarchy is dictated by who's at the top of it, I would say.
That's a good point. You're making me think of an extreme example of this, of someone I knew who went to a school where there was really just one kid who somehow became dominant at the top of the dominance hierarchy, who liked to beat up other kids and enlisted other kids to beat up other kids, to the point where within this private school that wasn't generally like that, this class was under constant threat of being beat up. Everybody, all the time. Everybody was fighting.
Yeah, exactly. And as Wilson says, your second circuit gets imprinted by whoever the nearest alpha male is, basically.
What do you think? I'm a little bit skeptical of this imprinting process with this. Well, maybe it's about accessing higher circuits, but I've just seen so many people who go from submissive to dominant or vice versa in their lives, or really alter this. It doesn't seem so fixed. What do you guys think of that?
Yeah, I think in general, the imprinting process is reversible. It's just that, whatever happens early on carries a lot of momentum. And the earlier it happens and the more intense it is, the harder it is to change.
Yeah, I think that's well put. I agree with what Chris said. I do think stuff that happens in adolescence can affect this circuit a lot. Like basically Jordan Peterson talks about the lobsters a lot, right? Like he talks about this circuit in relation to lobsters, because he points out that lobsters have a similar dominance hierarchy and a similar serotonin system in their brains that modulates this circuit. And he uses that as an argument to say this circuit is common not only to all mammals, but to the majority of animals, basically. And it's interesting because he says basically, like, if a lobster has a terrible defeat, then like the defeats carry a lot of momentum. Like the defeat will compound. So if it's defeated, it'll curl, it'll like walk around in a different lobster posture. It'll like flee from battles more. It'll be more likely to lose against even weaker lobsters, just because it's imprinted itself like, I'm a loser. And I think you can see that in humans too.
Mm. Okay, sorry, I'm not 100% sure of this. Maybe you are, Ariel. I think it's super interesting. But I remember Jordan Peterson saying something about how you can like upregulate and downregulate serotonin, and it changes the dominance behavior in like both lobsters and humans. Do you know enough about that to talk about it?
I think the point is basically that like if you give a lobster an SSRI, increase their serotonin levels, they will begin to act more like a neutral or dominant lobster, even if they were originally like a submissive lobster.
Yeah, so as we read in Impro and other places, if you are a weaker, lobster or a weaker human or, weaker member of the hierarchy, then it's a good survival, it's an adaptive survival technique to act like you're at, you basically, the best strategy is to find where you should be in the hierarchy and inhabit that place. Because, if you're weak and you act like you're strong, then the really strong people will come after you, and that will be not so good for you. And if you're if you're strong and you act weak, then this is also not adaptive, because then you end up not surviving and replicating as much as you should.
I don't know. I mean, Jordan Peterson's rule 1 is stand up straight with your shoulders back, which is basically saying, and he has a section there where he's like, people are like, responds to that objection, like, well, what if I'm just a weak loser? Shouldn't I just like stand like a weak loser? And he's like, no, like even if you've had failures in the past, you still want to like face being with like courage and openness, basically.
Yeah, I think there can be a mismatch between, if you have an intense, experience of defeat, and then you have this kind of physiological response where then further defeat becomes more easy. I think that was much more adaptive in the lobster days, and much less adaptive in sort of human societies where, one major defeat should not set you back that much.
So I think this kind of goes back to like what we were hitting on in the survival circuit, whereas some environments are safe and some environments are not. Jordan Peterson's audience is predominantly living in a pretty safe environment. If you're living in Western society, it's not going to hurt you to walk around standing up straight with your shoulders back and to keep going after failure and persevere. It's a way of possibly eventually ascending. But if you're in a dangerous situation and you're walking around with your chest puffed up and you don't know how to fight, that's not good for you. And I think that like some of these reactions and the way that people get stuck after defeat, like showing this submissive posture, it's adaptive to environments where there is real danger.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think, as you said, our society is safe enough. There aren't predators, generally in cities. I mean, in some parts of some cities, I guess you could see some people as predators. But yeah, in general, like in the daylight in public spaces, you can walk around confidently and, keep your shoulders back, keep your chest up.
Sure.
Well,
and when you do face a predator, if you don't know how to fight, you probably should display a submissive posture in that instance.
No, if if you don't know how to fight, you should be confident because that's what's going to deter bullies. If bullies see somebody weak, then they're going to want to pick on them. But if they see somebody who looks, sorry,
that's a gamble, though. I mean, they might actually be really skilled at harming people, and yeah, that could be a bad decision to be all.
I was
come at me, bro.
I was talking about in the incidents of like, okay, I'm already being mugged. Like.
Okay. That's a different situation.
I mean, I think I feel like, especially like being a woman, like there is almost an element like you can fall into that acting like prey in a world of predators dynamic. Like it's easy to fall into that mindset. And I think one way to avoid that is to not act like prey and not look like prey and not think of yourself as prey and not hide away like prey.
Yeah,
right.
I want to clarify that I totally agree with you. I think if you're trying to avoid being victimized, you want to not look like prey. But if you're already in a situation where somebody's attacking you, at least for me, like I don't want to pretend like I can fight back or try to fight back if I'm actually in an attack situation.
I don't know. Because it depends. Because if they're being aggressive towards you, and then you signal that, hey, like I'm an easy target, I'm exactly what you thought I was, then they might continue. I had this experience in a bar many years ago, and this guy came up to my friend and he's like, hey man, can I have a cigarette? And my buddy SS gives him a cigarette. And then he's like, hey, can I have another one? And SS is like, what? He's kind of confused. Like, this guy's getting unreasonably aggressive. And I walk over. I don't know how to fight, but I'm not going to let my buddy like get into trouble like that. And this guy starts swearing at me. And I'm like, oh, okay. And inside, I'm kind of shaken up, but I'm also on another level, somehow calm. And I said something to him, and he walked off. And then he came back 5 minutes later, and he's like, I'm sorry, man. I was just being a drunken idiot. And I was like, that was very weird. It was like, because I managed to maintain my composure, he saw that I wasn't the right person to pick on, and he let it go. So I think that situation could have played out very differently.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it's all kind of a economic calculus where you're thinking about. So let's think about, you know, a lion on prairie or something like that. You know, the lion is a predator, and there are various types of prey that are wandering around on the prairie. You know, if the prey is abundant, if there's a lot of prey, you know, the predator's survival strategy is to find a weak one that isn't too much trouble and, you know, take it down, eat it. If there isn't that much prey, then the lion is going to have to go for a prey that's a little bit more difficult to catch. So, you know, basically, if you don't think you can win a fight, you just need to appear stronger than the weakest prey.
I have a story maybe that'll clarify a little bit what I think about this. Like I've had two instances where I think somebody was maybe trying to mug me at night, where I was walking alone and a man approaches me from out of nowhere and starts like really walking towards me and like kind of pursuing me. And in both cases, what I ended up doing was turning around and saying, "Hi." And that stopped they just walked away. But had they continued to pursue at that point and, you know, maybe held up a gun or something like that and tried to rob me, what I'm saying is that at that point, if I don't think I can fight them, I don't want to induce them to kill me. I don't want to pretend like I can fight them and get them to act more aggressive than they otherwise would have. That's where I would, you know, throw out my hands, give them whatever they want.
Right, exactly. If they think, oh, you know, like there will be other prey, basically, then they'll let you get away. But if they're desperate and they're like, no, I have to, you know, defeat this prey, then they're going to keep pursuing.
Well, what came into play there was actually a slightly different principle. This is about a neuro-linguistic programming thing about state breaks. So it's like when you put somebody in a position where you do something that they very much do not expect. So if somebody comes up to attack you, they either expect you to be aggressive or they expect you to be defensive or weak, or capitulate, whatever. But they don't expect you to be like, "Hey, man, it was great to see you." Or like I'm trying to remember. I think his name is Darren Brown. He's a magician, and he talked about a situation where somebody approached him in England and started being aggressive. And he said, "Well, you know, it's very strange. The walls here in England are very short. Like my garden wall is very short." And the guy's like, "What?" He's like, "Yeah, you know, the ones I lived in Spain for a while, and they're like 9 foot. It's weird, right?" And the guy's like, "I don't know." Totally threw him off balance. So it is kind of a dominance thing, because it shows that this is like frame control or something. But it's like they're trying to impose this frame, the dominant frame of somebody dominant, somebody aggressive, and you're saying, "Hey, well, that's completely not to do with my frame. I have this completely other frame where this world is beautiful and wonderful, or interesting and strange, or even confusing," and that is it's a kind of dominance, but it's not dominance in the way we'd normally think of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because like the person mugging you or a person trying to aggress on you is like they're in circuit too. Like you're probably not. If you're like going like, "Ooh, what clever strategy?" Like then you're bringing in some higher circuits, but they're in circuit too. And they're like thinking like dominance, can I dominate this person? And when you start like acting weird or doing something they don't expect, like it is a show of confidence and of dominance. And it like in a way like Katie's story and that story Kurt just told, like it, in a way, like it's not a pure aggressive reaction, but it still is an assertion of dominance. And it's interesting that in these escape stories, like it's still not like the person still isn't just like submitting and going like, "Oh, please, 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 please," like the strategy still isn't submission. It just seems like it's just a different flavor.
Yeah, it's break the frame. Yeah, it's a kind of dominance, but it's a mental dominance, a very different kind of dominance.
That's true. It is kind of a mental dominance. It's not really It's not really a submission, but it's a type of dominance that I don't think would induce aggression in most people, because it's not feeding back on their like intimidation, or the same kind of intimidation anyway.
Yes.
A milder example of this is where I first learned this concept. Is I was being picked on in middle school. I had a kid who was calling me mop head, making fun of my hair, and I came home crying to my dad and like, oh my god, they're calling me mop head, and I didn't know how to deal with it, and I was gonna relax my hair and straighten my curls and everything. And my dad said, try this, because he's trying to get a reaction out of you so that he can feel better about himself. When he calls you mophead, just throw him off base. Pretend like it's a friendly nickname. Make up a nickname for him and pretend like you're best friends and see what he does. And so I tried it. The next time he called me mophead, he was like, mophead. I was like, hey, cheese, what's up? How are you? And it was so scary. I was so scared. But he was like, and then he didn't talk to me again for several months. But later he actually came up and apologized to me. He said, hey, your hair doesn't look like a mop, and I'm sorry. And then I think he started trying to date me afterwards. He was kind of flirting with me.
So do we want to talk about how Circuit 2 and Circuit 1 kind of combine together for this two-axis system that gives us these four sort of personality imprints?
Sure. Yeah, like basically Robert Anton Wilson cross-sections Circuit 1 and 2. So he identifies like four possible personality categories based on these two. So you have people who are dominant and approaching, people who are dominant and like retreating, like considering the world unsafe. So that's like maybe like the general type, the general archetype. And you have people who are submissive and friendly. So that's people who are like needy, like always trying to go to look for other people to meet their needs. Like they're submissive, but they're approaching. And then people who are submissive and retreating. Those people who are like just hostile and submissive and yeah.
Yeah, and he connects it with these sort of ancient medieval humors, the bilious, sanguinary, choleric, and phlegmatic. And you can also see this system, four-type system, in things like Myers-Briggs. I thought that was interesting.
Which one do we think we are?
Well, I think that as a kid, I was phlegmatic, friendly weakness, kind of, approaching, but submissive. That would be, I think, what the INTP is. But I think you can change, you can kind of re-imprint yourself, and you can change how you approach the world. And I think over time, I've gotten a lot more like stronger, I guess, in my interactions with people. So I think you can definitely sort of train your weaker circuits and change your personality.
I definitely used to be submissive and retreating in most social situations. However, I don't know where this would fit in, but I always held like a kind of like mental dominance where I was maybe submissive and retreating in the situation that I was in, but I, like within myself, I just felt that I needed to be in a different frame and tried to like get into different frames as much as possible. I didn't take a ton of stock in like the hierarchy that I was in for the most part. Nowadays, I think I'm more dominant. I think I've gotten a lot more confident, and I don't know what you would call this weird frame breaking strategy that we've been discussing lately, but when I feel threatened, that's what I try to do.
Yeah, I think there's kind of a mental dominance and a physical dominance. And I think humans have definitely that mental aspect to dominance. And people in the sort of neuro-linguistic programming community talk about frame control, as Kurt was mentioning, where you kind of just assert that your reality is stronger than anybody else is asserting their reality. And so you become the dominant person in the interaction.
it's kind of funny how Wilson is talking here. I mean, he compares it to that sanguine, choleric, melancholy, phlegmatic model. But normally, when people talk about that model, like I think the book is called Personality Plus, where it was like updated for the modern age. It's like every model, every personality type has its place. But here, Wilson is like basically sanguine is kind of what you want to be most of the time. Like you want to be friendly, strong most of the time, and willing to talk to people. But I do think every part of that has its benefits. But for myself, I'd say I used to be, what is it? I forget how to put it into the Wilson language, but I used to be phlegmatic, like introverted and focused on other people, or I used to be melancholic, introverted, and focus on tasks. But now I'm a more friendly, strong, or sanguine.
So were you submissive and retreating or submissive and friendly? I was confused.
I was a bit of both.
Okay.
And you, Ariel?
I think I went back and forth several times. As I think when I was a little kid, there was times where I went between all four. There was times where I was hostile and submissive. There was times where I was hostile and dominant, kind of depending on which social group I was in and stuff like that, or like which part of my life. And there was times where I was definitely the needy one. And I'm trying to be the dominant and friendly one, like to just be confident and be friendly at the same time, which I feel like I can do, but it takes energy. And I think as an adult, I developed the ability to be like dominant and hostile really effectively, which felt like an improvement over either of the submissive types. Like I sort of realized that like, if I fell back on like intellectualizing and arguing, I could be the dominant one in most interactions. And that felt like an improvement over before. So I think I sort of relied on that for a while, but I'm trying to move away from that and be more the good one.
Do we think that it is inherently desirable to be sanguine?
So I think, so Wilson talks about that we're moving from an era where human interaction or human success is maximized by everybody sort of playing their part. And we're moving from that to this kind of a new paradigm where people should just be strong. People should be able to be any of these things in whatever the situation calls for. People should be strong on all of the circuits, and they should be able to emphasize the behavior that's necessary for the moment. But I do think that sanguine is kind of the in this new era, where everybody needs to be kind of peer to peer instead of hub and spoke or dominance and submissive. Basically, we're all peers. And so I think the sanguine type works the best for that.
All right. It's like you need to be able to communicate with people effectively, reduce the friction, smooth things over, or have a good time with other people. That's a very important skill.
Although, like Wilson does point out some of the flaws in sanguine, like that sanguine can just smooth over problems and be like very normative. Like now that we're talking about this, like Katie's question kind of prompted me, but I think there probably are situations where the other four are appropriate. Like in particular, like the hostile dominant, like if you have to go to war, which sometimes you may, then that might be an appropriate stance.
Yeah, if you're in a dangerous situation or something, you want to get your friends out of some place where they're in trouble, that's probably the appropriate response.
Just a thought experiment. I wonder if it would be possible to maintain a kind of friendly demeanor even within a hostile conflict with someone in a genuine way. Like I know sometimes people will do that in a passive aggressive sort of way, but would it be possible for a leader, even in say something like war, to maintain like a sanguine, we're not going to back down. This isn't what we want. We wish it wasn't coming to this kind of conflict, but we're genuinely doing it because we believe it's the best thing to do in this situation, like friendly and empathetic, but dominant stance, even in an inherently aggressive situation.
Yes. So there's a thing called soft power in sort of global geopolitics, where U.S. politicians like to talk about this, where basically you approach the world that way, as you described, we're powerful, we're in charge, we're going to try to be nice to everybody, but if we need to, we're going to fix things by force. And I think that stance is kind of what you want to be if you're trying to prevent conflict, if you're trying to keep things stable, basically. I think that's the correct attitude to have. When things devolve into war, then as Ariel said, it's probably better to be hostile. I mean, but still, you're still looking for some kind of resolution. You may not be looking to just totally annihilate your enemy. You're hopefully looking for some kind of a peace treaty eventually.
Yeah. Well, Wilson mentions Dwight D. Eisenhower as this fatherly figure, and as a president, he also had to make some tough decisions. So that might be the kind of model for what you're describing, Katie.
Yeah, I mean, I think in what Katie's describing, I still see some hostility. I think you're going to war to someone and you're like, you are our enemy. We are looking to destroy what you stand for. And you are creating an unsafe environment that we have to navigate through carefully. Like, I think that is the First Circuit danger hostile stance, even if, maybe it can incorporate some higher circuit, like Circuit 5, like equanimity. Like maybe you can incorporate some like Zen. You can become like in one of our videos, they have like the Buddha soldier, like the Zen soldier. Maybe that's an element of it, but I still think it is fundamentally the hostile stance.
Yeah, you're probably right. It's a hostile stance fundamentally with some dress up that can maybe make it even a little bit scarier. A lot of this discussion kind of reminds me of game theory. When we're talking about dominance and submission and survival strategies, where generally it's accepted that mathematically the best thing to do is to maintain a friendly stance, but if somebody hits you, hit back.
Yeah, I like that quote from Peterson where he says, a good man is not a weak man. A good man is a dangerous man who knows how to control himself. And that's a kind of Buddha warrior, like a humble warrior.
Right. I think that it goes back to the idea of soft power. Like, we could destroy you if we wanted, but we're nice. So don't push it.
I guess we want to move on to Circuit 3.
Sure.
So I can tell you about Circuit 3. So Wilson calls it semantic time binding circuit, which is a bit of a mouthful. It's focused on human symbols like language, and it's for building and reinforcing reality tunnels, or these maps of the universe that we have within our minds. And it's associated with rationality, logic, skepticism. It's associated with certain drugs, stimulants like amphetamines, cocaine, caffeine. If you've ever met anybody who's really whizzing on those drugs, they can't really control their mouth. They just talk a lot. It's like this monkey chatter that just keep going on and on. So Wilson calls it that semantic time binding circuit. It's time binding because you can take the knowledge, you can tell somebody, pass it down in an oral tradition, or write it down, and you can give it to the next generation. How did you guys understand this circuit?
I understood this circuit to be the first circuit that we think of as uniquely human, at least for the most part. That this is the circuit where things like language, knowledge, reason, thinking come in.
Yeah, I think Wilson would agree with you on that. That this is basically the thing that sets us apart from the animals, gives us speech, gives us labeling things and basically creating reality tunnels, creating models of the universe.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of us who are like highly verbally fluent Westerners can probably relate to this circuit a lot. Like I know I really liked his description of like people on like cocaine or energy drinks or just like because it's like if you've ever been in that state, like it basically feels like every time you talk, it's like bliss. It's like feels amazing. It's like talk. It doesn't even matter, and then the other person talks, and you just have to like wait for them to finish, and it's horrible while they're talking. But then you get to talk again, and it feels great. And that's almost like an extreme version of, I mean, a tendency that I've seen in myself, and I think is probably pretty common,
especially for podcasters.
I just want to interrupt you guys. I have something so important to say right now. I'm just kidding. I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, I do remember I had a friend who was like that, and I guess now it just dawned on me. I mean, he had ADHD, and he was always taking these amphetamines or this drug similar to amphetamines. That's probably why he was like that.
Yeah. So I think this circuit is something that I definitely imprinted very strongly. It's definitely has been my dominant circuit for probably all my life as an INTP. The T is for, the rational circuit. And yeah, I was diagnosed with ADHD in college, and I took amphetamines, and I felt great. And actually, I had some problems with it because it was a little too good. But yeah, Wilson talks about how people who are rationalists have this circuit as sort of imprinted a little too hard because they think that being rational is this sort of objective way of seeing the world, when really it's just that particular reality tunnel, and there are other reality tunnels which may or may not be superior for the situation.
I can relate to everything that you're saying really hard. I'm also an INTP. I also definitely imprinted this rationality circuit hard and strong and early, and it was extremely dominant. And I had my reality tunnel at points so well constructed and tightly constructed that I really felt like almost in a mathematical way I had the right answers and the right view of certain things, like atheism, anarchism, like everything, just all my models, vegan, everything fit together in like this perfect, cohesive, rational model in my head. And it wasn't until later, and especially in the past few years, where I started to break down those models and I started to be able to enter other reality tunnels, and I started being more in touch with things on an emotional level and an intuitive level. But yeah. Oh, and I also like, even something like coffee is extremely strong for me. Stimulants are like,
and we're all too similar. We need to like find like a non-intellectual bully to like add a different perspective.
So I interviewed a few years back, I interviewed our friend LD, Leandra Dixon, and he had an interesting story because he was raised in a church and he believed very strongly in the church. But at some point around, I think around 12, 13 years old, he started to realize, hang on, what they're telling me here isn't quite right. This doesn't quite jive with reality. And then he swung the other way, and he went a very hardcore atheist and skeptic. And I remember asking him, why does that happen to people? Why do they become so skeptical? And he said one of the key reasons is this disappointment. So this would be the point where people get imprinted when it starts to dawn on them that what the church is saying isn't true, and they feel so let down, and so like they think, I've just been lied to, I've been deceived my entire life, and it hits them so hard that they go into this circuit, and then they might get trapped in this skeptical mindset.
Yeah, Wilson talks about how humans are one of the only species, I think, that have a dominant hand. Like people tend to be right-handed, And that's because his theory is because, well, I think the general theory is because this semantic circuit is dominant in most people. And that's how we imprint kids too. We imprint kids with this circuit. So that causes people to be right-handed. People who are left-handed tend to be more right-brained, tend to be more intuitive. So yeah, I thought that was interesting. I also wanted to say, I also used to be religious, like Leandrew. And I think ultimately I stopped being religious. And the reason is because the rational circuit was imprinted so strongly, by society. And then society also tried to imprint me with this morality, which had this kind of irrational explanation. And so, this kind of supernatural explanation. And so society, imprints you that supernatural things are irrational. And then it also says, but, here's this morality, which you should base on things that are supernatural. And so I was just like, that's a contradiction. And my rational side won out. And so,
so did you hold up some liquor stores after that?
Oh yeah. Yeah. I just went nuts, killing people and stuff. It was bad.
I thought so. What are healthy expressions of this rationality or semantic circuit in a fully realized human being?
I have a tendency to think that this circuit should be pretty strongly developed in a fully realized human being. But I think that the trap is when you create your reality tunnel too tight. We talked about the idea of reality tunnels a little bit, where basically it's this idea that everything that we experience in the world comes in through our senses and comes in through the models that we've created in our mind. But sometimes we'll create models that have been useful to us, but are so tightly wound that we miss things that are outside, or we misinterpret what other people are saying, or we misinterpret events because everything is funneling through this filter. And I think that's the danger. I think it's healthy if you can, I think it's healthy if you have tunnels that are well constructed and well built and you analyze things and are rational with things, but it's unhealthy if you're stuck in one.
Yeah, I think it's important to develop this capacity for creating a semantic model of the universe, because if you don't, then I feel like it's inevitable that you'll just fall into somebody else's model. You'll just become sort of semantically submissive to the people you're around. You have to be able to stand up for your own ideas, I think. I think that's why this circuit is important.
One interesting thing about the 8-circuit model is, like, it's 8 circuits. We're at number 3, and number 3 is the semantic rational circuit. It's really interesting because in our society, we kind of almost like put rationality up on this pedestal and like, oh, it's like the ideal of humanity, but this model places it pretty low. So it's interesting because, like, I think there's a tendency with circuit, like I think people can get really stuck on circuit 3. As it's like, he talks about it in the book, like the book was written in 1982, but I think this holds today. Like, a lot of people in our society, a lot of people don't become adept at circuit 3. Like, everyone has a circuit 3 because we all, except for feral children, everyone has words. But a lot of people, kind of like what Chris just described, just kind of submit themselves to other people's semantic circuits or semantic models, and never really become good at never really master circuit 3. So I think when you do master circuit 3, it's very easy to feel like a very egotistic, like to become egotistical about it, like to develop an ego, like, oh, I'm so smart, I'm so clever, I have such good ideas, look at me, I'm at circuit 3. When really it's like you're standing on like the third of an 8-stage process. So I thought that was a really interesting insight I found.
Yeah, I think that relates to what John Vervaeke talks about in his Awakening from the Meaning Crisis lectures, when he talks about how we've kind of lost our non-semantic, when you talk about the third circuit being kind of lower on the hierarchy in this system. Vervaeke talks about how there are all these other kinds of knowing. There's the perspectival knowing and the participatory knowing, and the what it means to participate in something, what it means to experience something, and all of those things are kind of nonverbal. You can't really put them into words, and yet they're almost certainly bigger and more important in terms of human development than simply the words.
I'd say that a healthy expression of this would be like if somebody asks you to do a debate and they're like, okay, you're going to assume the affirmative or you're going to assume the negative, and you can propose all of the ideas, all of the arguments in favor of that side. You don't necessarily need to get attached to them. That or if somebody else is trying to argue something and you can think, oh yeah, well I could see how this works because of this and this, or steel manning a position, that's probably a good way this expresses itself.
I think this circuit, like at one point, Robert Anton Wilson, we're going to get into, I think this circuit is most effective when it's combined with the higher circuits. Like Robert Anton Wilson, at one point in the book, he talks about how Beethoven achieved like high levels of circuit 3 adeptness when it came to music. So that's like technical skill. Like this circuit is basically looking at what's already there and becoming really good at it. But to actually make the leap into like a leap of insight or a leap of brilliance or a leap into something transcendent, you need to bring in the higher circuits, which we're going to talk about later.
Right. Yeah. I think the idea there is that music is actually coming from a whole bunch of different circuits. But it's hard to communicate what those circuits are saying unless you master the sort of mathematical elements of music. And so he says that Beethoven did that really well.
Mm-hmm. I thought the Beethoven example was interesting too, because it makes me think of sometimes when you'll watch a musician, especially you'll see this often with singers. I think or maybe it's just more obvious with singers, somebody who's really technically adept and can hit all the high notes and can, do their runs and everything like that. But when they're singing, it's not connected, or when they're playing piano, it's not connected. It's emotionally dead. You can feel that they're not feeling the music. I think that would be a good example of somebody caught in this circuit. Well, and some people can't see it either. I think that's another thing too. Like, I get the sense that sometimes there are some musicians who wouldn't even know what you were talking about if they were playing something technically correct, but not emoting it.
Yes. I remember there was a guy in my music production class, and he had Asperger's, and he was obsessed with metal. And he was like, well, this verse has to be 12 bars long. That's the only way. It's just not metal if it's not 12 bars long, and that kind of thing. And yes, he could hit every note, but trying to describe that soul, like trying to tell him rock and roll ain't about being perfect, it would go over his head.
There's extremes on both ends, right? Because it's like if someone it's like technical mastery seems to be in most cases a precondition for brilliance. Like it seems like there's something a little bit sad also about someone who is like, I want to be a painter, or I want to be a writer, or I want to be rock and roll, but like they don't have any technical skill. It's like people don't like to see that. Like it's probably not going to work out for that person either. But the technical skill alone also isn't sufficient.
Mm-hmm. I think in the vast majority of cases, you need a combination of both, unless you're so strong in one or the other that it's just okay. Like I'm thinking of some really abstract performance art, where they're just emoting. And a lot of people really hate that stuff because there isn't really any technical skill involved. Or like these abstract paintings where people say, my toddler could have done that. It's like, well, maybe, sort of, kind of, but there's something missing. There's some value in it. And then, it is cool to watch like a virtuoso at an instrument, even if they're just playing Flight of the Bumblebee without any emotion too.
Yeah. And I mean, even the people like the really abstract postmodern art, like it tends to, I'd like to think at least it comes from a place of like having like studied art and like understood like the flow of ideas and being like, this is the thing that's going to continue the conversation of this increasingly abstract history of art. So I think there is still, although I think there are examples where the technical element is lacking and people pull it off.
Mm-hmm.
So if someone is in denial or rejecting this circuit, what would that look like?
Well, I don't think there's many people that deny it or reject it in the most extreme sense, because this circuit has to do with like language and symbols in general, which is mostly how we communicate. But to a certain extent, like there's a lot of people that reject logic. You see it all the time, especially with people who are extremely religious, whether it's about spiritual beliefs or about something else. They will not compute it or it doesn't even matter to them if you bring up some point that disproves something that they're saying. They're so emotionally attached that maybe they'll just defensively reject your argument, or maybe some people just don't even seem to evaluate arguments or like carry logical concepts through.
I think
they'll just say stuff that they feel matches up with their position, and it doesn't matter how logical it is or if it makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
I think what Wilson would say is that the first two circuits have a lot more influence on the third circuit than people who are strong on the third circuit would like to admit. So as he says, that what the thinker thinks, the prover proves. And I think, I don't know if he says this anywhere in the book, but it seems to me that the third circuit is the prover. And, you know, the thinker can be any of the other circuits. But if you have a lot of times you'll notice that people's ideologies are fundamentally self-serving. And if you point this out to them, they'll deny it because, you know, it's not visible to them. They don't even realize that they're doing it. Yeah, I actually think that's how most people's ideologies are. They kind of have these first and second circuit or fourth circuit ways of seeing the world, and then they use their third circuit to rationalize what those other circuits are thinking, or prove what those other circuits are thinking.
I think that you're right, Chris, that most people have ideologies based on first or second or fourth circuit, or probably first, second, or fourth circuit, and then use the third circuit to justify it. But then there are some people also that just barely use the third circuit at all. Like they might, maybe they'll attach onto other people's arguments that they've heard, but there are some people that don't seem to actually think through or process whether things make rational sense. It's just you hear something and you feel aligned with it or not aligned with it, so you adopt it or you don't.
Or you just don't even care that much about beliefs and you just like are just going from thing to thing.
Yeah, that too. It's often surprising. The amount of people that you can ask about some controversial topic, like abortion, a political topic, I don't know, do you think that there's life after death or something like that? And they'll just say, I don't know. I haven't really thought about it. Yeah.
Okay, here's something like in response to Kurt's question. It's a little bit tangential, but like Kurt's question makes me think of Maoist China. And I'm not totally sure how this relates, but they were extremely anti-intellectual, but they also, their whole system was based on a highly intellectual ideology. So they had like Maoist Marxism that they were imposing on the people, which is a highly maybe one of the most intellectual systems that's ever been used as a practical system of governance. But meanwhile, they were like, intellectuals are bourgeois, they need to be punished. Anyone who had like a high school education was considered intellectual, and you'd get like these like teenagers like separated from their families and exiled to the mountains to live with the peasants, like uneducated peasants, for like illiterate people. Like, okay, you're exiled to live with the peasants for 1,000 years. That's your new role in Maoist China. You get to understand the workers now. And like their like violins would be taken away and they wouldn't be allowed to read any book other than Mao's little red book. And so it makes like I look at that and it just seems so bizarre to me because it seems like this like extreme circuit 3 denial, but also this like extreme circuit 3 complex. And I'd be really curious what you guys think of that example.
Yeah, so I think what's happening there is that's a perfect segue into talking about brainwashing, which Wilson talks about at length. As we know from the, the 8 points of ideological totalism, that Maoist China is like the synecdoche, the ultimate example of ideological totalism. And in ideological totalism, it's not necessarily, it's almost like a defining characteristic that the people who are running the cult or whatever it is, the country, are pushing this ideology on their followers, but they themselves are not necessarily following that ideology. And so when you talk about this contradiction where intellectualism is both, loved and hated, I think that's an example. I think we're seeing an example of that. We're seeing kind of people who are intellectuals talking about intellectual things who are trying to dominate people who are not intellectuals. And the way that they're doing this is by teaching those people that intellectuals are evil, even though they themselves are intellectuals.
I don't know a lot about Maoist China, but do you know if most of the Communist Party leaders in China were intellectuals themselves, or if they were people who had really wrote, emotionally accepted an ideology which was developed in an intellectual way?
I think how it tended to go was the ones at the top were highly intellectual, but they had an ideology that their intellectualism was good because it was mixed with practice, and that intellectualism divorced from practice was bourgeois and corrupt, and there's all these is bad. And a lot of people in the middle ranks, or like the enforcers, came from the uneducated classes.
All right. So I have read that they would do things like you were saying about taking away their violins and everything, prohibiting writers from writing, and just taking somebody like a uneducated farmer who'd never written really any short stories or anything and said, all right, you're a novelist now. Go ahead. And people didn't really read those books.
So, okay, my little pet hypothesis right now, based on what all you guys have said, is that you probably have intellectuals at the top who are really bought into this ideology, also emotionally, social, morally, which is like the next circuit that we'll talk about, and like from a survival level, because it's threatening to not follow the ideology once it's become so dominant. So you're emotionally attached to this intellectual ideology. They're using their circuit 3 to develop this rationalization that generally intellectualism is bad for the masses. But it's also highly strategic. I don't know who it was who came up with that idea initially. Maybe it was Mao. But I wonder if it was a genuine belief or if it was a recognition that when people are practicing rationalism, that means questioning ideas. And you don't want that. So if you can come up with a justification to ban any idea questioning, then that's definitely going to serve your power.
Yeah, I think Maoist China is a classic implementation of what Robert Anton Wilson is talking about when he's talking about brainwashing. I mean, the process goes, you deprive your minion, I guess, your cult member of their survival. You basically and all communist revolutions do this, right? They kill off all the farmers, so there's this giant famine, and so everybody goes back to First Circuit, fight or flight, and then you dominate them. So you have guns, right? And you say, do what we want or else. And then what you want is the population or the cult members or whatever to take on your ideology. And so, at first there's a lot of resentment, and then eventually sort of Stockholm syndrome sets in, and the people that you're trying to manipulate eventually just sign on to whatever reality tunnel or ideology you're imposing on them.
This might be a good segue into Circuit 4, because there's definitely some Circuit 4 elements going on in this situation.
Yeah, absolutely. So Circuit 4 is the moral socio-sexual circuit. And what Robert Anton Wilson says about this is it's imprinted by your first orgasm or mating experiences around puberty and conditioned by your tribal taboos, basically your society's taboos or views around sex. It processes sexual pleasure. It processes definitions of right and wrong within society, reproduction, adult parental responsibility, like your gender roles and sex roles, and how you raise your young. One thing that I thought was really interesting about this circuit is he really linked morality with sexuality, which is something that people like to morally police quite a bit. But I didn't know how linked I feel that those things always are. So I'm curious about you guys' interpretations of this circuit and how morality and sexuality interact.
I mean, one thing my mind goes to is this example we were just talking about, Maoist China. Like, one thing Mao did is he like really, really pushed the population to hardcore reproduce, which is why China has such a massive population. And in the past few decades, it's such a massive labor force. So, I mean, in that case, I mean, definitely not all of the moralizing was focused on sexuality, but it was a big part of the strategy.
Mm-hmm.
It makes me think of that old expression, lie back and think of England. Like, women weren't trying to have sex for pleasure. They were doing it for the good of their country. So it's highly, this highly moralistic idea imposed on the bedroom life.
Think of the Queen looking down on you sternly.
Mm.
Yeah. They say that in Canada too.
Every religion and society has restricted sexuality or made sexuality a strong moral issue. I'm thinking about, Islamic culture, Christian cultures. One of the main things that people often talk about when they're coming out of a religious belief system is they didn't want to feel sexually restricted. Maybe that's the sexual morality that our Western society is imposing on us now, that of some kind of morality of sexual freedom and liberation.
The way that Wilson connects sexuality and morality is he talks about how societies are this stochastic process where there are kind of these random processes, and then certain things are selected out of the random process. And so norms around sexual behavior are a way of selecting things that randomly happen, and basically differentiating your tribe from other tribes. So, he basically says, specifically which morals, which norms are selected is not important. What's important is that your norms are different from everybody else's, so that your tribe is differentiated from everybody else's.
I don't know. I think the norms are important, though. Like, it seems to me that, like, part of the reason why maybe sexuality has such an important place in morality is because sexuality determines the future. Like, thou shalt not kill and non-sexual strictures are about the present, but sexuality, like, he talks about, like, something like the ancient Israelites. Like, for them, they had very strict sexual mores against exogamy, against participating in, like, the sexual rites of the Babylonians and stuff like that, because they were trying to survive as a people against the threat of assimilation for a lot of their history. Whereas, like, other groups mandate exogamy if they're, like, inbred on an island. Like, it depends on the situation.
That's exactly what I'm saying, and that's exactly what Wilson is saying. He's saying that what particular sexual morals are selected is not, there's no, like, objective morals that are necessarily good. What is good is that the society picks norms that are different from the norms of other societies.
I think I'm making a claim beyond that, though, because I'm not just saying that, like, the norms need to be, like, unique so that society differentiates itself. I'm saying the norms are also fitted to the situation of the society.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he says something like people who have a positive imprinting experience tend to develop a more positive associations with sexuality and more of like a live and let live approach to morality, as opposed to people who are imprinted with negative experiences tend to think of things as being more like everything is criminal and get very caught up on policing behavior, sexual and otherwise.
I'd like to bring up Diogenes. So there's a story about Diogenes masturbating in the marketplace, and people might hear that story and think, well, he's just a pervert. But Viveki's interpretation was that Diogenes was trying to demonstrate the difference between a purity code and a morality code. And so it seems like for a lot of history, those things have been linked together. Maybe starting with Diogenes, they start to get separated a little bit.
Yeah, so I think this is maybe where I took a little bit of issue or have some skepticism about this circuit, or feel that maybe another circuit is needed, because this circuit seems to be linking morality to sexual purity codes, which they often are, but I think that they are distinct and different, and then we don't really have another circuit to point to for morality codes.
I don't think that Wilson is saying that these are that you can't have morality without sexuality. I think he's just saying that those things are the same circuit. They use the same part of the brain.
I don't agree with that. Like, okay, so one of the reasons that we had me introduce this topic was because I kind of stereotypically, at least in childhood, and probably still do have like maybe a overactive morality circuit, if we want to talk about this circuit. But it wasn't based around sexual norms. It certainly wasn't imprinted at adolescence. My fixation on morality and right and wrong started, I remember being highly fixated on when I was 4 years old, and maybe younger than that. And it certainly had nothing to do with sexuality.
Yeah, I'm not saying that you can't. I don't think Wilson is saying that you can't have morality without sexuality. I think he's just saying that they use the same circuit. When at the point that you hit puberty and you start to think about sexuality and norms surrounding it, you're using the moral circuit that you developed earlier.
Well, I think that's true in many cases, but I don't think that that's true of all people. I think that society tends to put sexuality in the morality circuit because sexuality and sexual norms have really strong consequences for society. Like, I think our morality circuit is built up around things like murder, theft, things that we see as destructive to society. And especially in the past, before birth control, before any kind of treatment for STDs, before condoms, sexuality was really threatening to society if there weren't strict norms about it. So it makes sense that it got linked with morality. But I think that that's starting to change. And some people flip the other way and associate like really strong sexual freedom and promiscuity with what's morally good. But I think that like the more that sexuality isn't like so threatening to the breakdown of society, the less it's linked with morality.
Katie, I don't know if you want to talk about this, but I'd be curious if you have any perspective on how polyamory could possibly be linked with your strong moral ideals in your own mind or in your own experience.
Okay, that's a good point. Maybe it's hypocritical because I did really like link morality and sexuality really heavily, and I had ideas about liberty, like very strong moral. I still do. I still have very strong ideas about personal freedom and liberty, and I saw polyamory or non-monogamy as being a practice that was more in alignment with liberty and personal freedom and non-competitiveness, but cooperation in personal relationships, as well as even though I didn't see it as like morally wrong to be monogamous, I did have certain reactions to that, and I felt like polyamory was more in line with my values. I think these days I started to see sexuality and relationship structures as a little bit more complicated than that, maybe not so linked to morality, but I think a lot of our reactions to sex and relationships are linked to our instincts. We have like strong emotional drives towards jealousy, but also towards wanting freedom. And I think I'm less moralistic about it now. I think it's okay for people to make their own choices and see what works for them. There.
I mean, I think that's the reason why I think Robert Anton Wilson might have a point about this circuit, because it seems like sexuality and the style of like someone's approach to morality and their approach to sexuality just so often seem parallel, even on a societal level. Like we're talking about our society becoming more like permissive sexually, and I see it becoming more permissive morally virtually at the exact same time. And there seems to be this like complex about gender and sexuality at the very center of it. They seem linked to me.
In what ways do you think society is becoming more permissive morally?
I think if you compare society today to society 100 years ago in both sexual and, I'm not sure they're different, but in both sexual and moral domains, like there's all kinds of ways, like I could go out dressed this way. It'd be very weird for me to be like showing a shoulder in the 1910s. Like I can blaspheme. I can sorry, I'm struggling a bit to come up with examples, even though there are so many.
Yeah.
Like listen to rock music. Rock music. Tattoo myself. And rock music didn't exist back then, but I can tattoo my skin. I can, all kinds of. I can commit, like adultery is much more accepted. Like there's all kinds of
drugs.
I just want to point out that everything you guys are pointing out are what Diogenes would classify as a purity code.
Yes. Except maybe adultery. What
about
depends on the situation.
Blasphemy, adultery, thou shalt not disrespect. That disrespecting my mother and my father is much more acceptable now than it was 100 years ago.
I think those are purity codes. Well,
it depends.
They're
the 10 Commandments.
Yeah, the lines blur. The lines blur.
Yeah, I mean, blasphemy for somebody who's an atheist. It's difficult to say that's a moral or immoral thing that they're doing, because it's right. That's not part of their frame. But in terms of disrespecting your mother and father, I can see how that's a moral thing.
Well, that's part of the thing, right? Like with the move towards atheism, like the strictures around the moral codes around both sexual and non-sexual domains of life have definitely loosened.
Do you see a difference between moral codes and do you guys all see a difference between moral codes and purity codes?
Yes, but I do think there are some gray areas.
I think Robert Anton Wilson has a point when he links them and suggests that they might not be different. I think he has a point. I'm not entirely sure. Like, how would you distinguish them?
I'm trying to work through that right now, because when this conversation has made me realize that they're maybe more linked than I initially thought or would like to admit. I would say hesitantly that purity codes are about your cultural taboos, and moral codes are about things that basically every culture would agree on, and not just because that's a coincidence, but because moral codes are about when you're forcibly like doing active harm to another. And not just because other people see you doing something they don't like and they're reacting negatively to it, but like you're actually materially harming another. I think there's a difference there.
I mean, that seems like a bit of an arbitrary definition of morality. Like that almost like a lot of people would define morality, a lot of cultures would define morality very differently than that.
Yeah,
So
every culture would put their own purity codes on top of it and lump it in with that. So
it seems like an arbitrary distinction though, because like you're basically saying like this narrow domain is what morality really is, and everything else that other societies call morality is purity codes that are a window dressing.
I'm okay with using a different term than morality, but I think that the distinction is valid.
Yeah, I think there's some kind of distinction. Chris and Katie, you probably remember that article from Jeffrey Tucker talking about the distinction between brutalism and humanitarian libertarians. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So
sorry, you're going to have to jog my memory.
Sure. Well, it's, I'll explain it anyway. So
brutalism is that an architectural style?
Yes, he was appropriating that term from architecture. So brutalism in architecture is like this form of modernism where things are very practical, bare bones. It doesn't matter if you see the insides of the building or anything like that. It's just extremely practical. And so the comparison he was making, or the distinction, he was talking about these kinds of libertarians who were saying, well, there's the non-aggression principle. I'm not hurting anybody. I'm not going to punch anybody or anything like that. But I have free speech, so I'm going to use it. So I'm going to drop as many F-bombs as I can fit into a sentence. Whereas humanitarian libertarians will think about things, the consequences of their actions, whether I'm going to offend people, how can I make life more wonderful for other people, and things like that. And so that's another way of looking at it. It's like the brutalism people, according to this strict definition of morality, they are being moral, but we'd all agree that I think all of us would agree we don't really want to be like those people who just use free speech just because we can, like some kind of 12-year-old who gets a keyboard and starts swearing all the time.
Right. I would say that like the brutalist libertarian culture is almost interestingly like a reverse of what we normally think of with cultural taboos. Like libertarian brutalism is basically just saying the non-aggression principle is the only principle, everything else flies, and they have a cultural taboo against criticizing or even bringing up how anything outside of the NAP's narrow window of what it sees as immoral might be undesirable or something that would be good to be worked on.
I mean, I kind of think like a further simplification with this libertarian idea that like the basic fundamentals of morality is to not harm others is because you're still making the individual subject you're still making the individual the subject of morality, which many moral systems don't do. Like many moral systems are geared towards prioritizing the good of the tribe or the good of the civilization or the good of the environment or the good of all animals. So it's not totally clear to me even that it's an obvious given that morality should be centered on not doing harm to others. There seems like there's still a lot of assumptions in there.
Yeah, so I think an important thing to talk about when we're talking about morality is natural selection, because I think you see something similar in morality that you see in genes. The sort of Dawkins idea of the selfish gene. I think you can sort of draw a parallel between that and the sort of moralities that develop in societies. And what I mean by that is, so Wilson talks about how we have this drive to create, when we have our own tribe, we have this drive to create our own morality that's kind of unique to us or unique to our tribe. And I think that's kind of similar to the reproductive strategy of reproducing outside of your gene pool, right? Reproducing with somebody who has different genes from you, and that way there's more diversity. And so what that does in morality is it creates lots of different new systems of morality. And so, life is this stochastic process. And, as time marches forward, some of those moral systems will be selected and some of them will die. And the ones that are selected will survive and grow bigger. And so I think it's not as important as it appears to select a moral system that is somehow objectively true. To me, it seems much more important that the moral system be sustainable and universal. Like, it needs to be able to grow and draw more people into it so that it can last longer. And I think that systems like the Ten Commandments are like that. They kind of, it's kind of, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal. These concepts are kind of universal because they lead to sustainable societies, not because they're somehow, objectively, cosmically true.
So I'm wondering right now, thinking about what you're saying, I agree with you. I agree with you these days. I wouldn't have used to. I was definitely on the hunt for an objectively, cosmically true moral system. But maybe in this discussion, we're getting a little bit caught in thinking about morality in terms of like in a third circuit kind of way. And maybe this kind of goes back to what you were saying, Ariel, about morality and sexuality being inherently linked. If we're thinking about like the system of emotional reactions that we feel, like moral approval or moral aversion, I think that most of us have some kind of gut reaction when we feel that something is right or wrong that may or may not be separate from our intellectual framework of what morality is. And perhaps I was getting confused with this because I do tend to have like gut reactions about sexuality, like in that kind of emotional system, but that's not attached to my reality tunnel of how I think about morality. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, that seems like a very third circuit way of viewing morality. Like, it should be disconnected from feelings of disgust, that feelings of disgust are one thing and morality is another pristine, rational thing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that what Wilson would say is that society has imprinted you with a certain moral system, and that's why you have those reactions to things.
My reactions to things have definitely changed over time. But yeah, you may be right. Okay, so Wilson would define those disgust or approval emotional reactions as morality, and not the conceptual like framework of what we think is right and wrong.
I'm not sure I can
define
define them as morality, but it'd say that they're in the same circuit.
They're in the same circuit.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think you might define them as morality.
Okay. But
So-
well, just to bring up one example about, like, Vivek gives this example of homosexuality and say, if I'm personally disgusted by homosexual acts, that doesn't necessarily mean they're morally wrong. So that's one where we can clearly see that there's this disconnect there.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think in Robert Anton Wilson's model, he probably wouldn't make recourse to that idea of objective morality. Like, he might say if you're living in the 1950s or whatever, or in some time period where your tribe doesn't like homosexuality and you feel disgust for homosexuality, that is a moral judgment you're making. But he probably wouldn't say it's objectively, that means it's objectively morally wrong.
Yeah.
So going back to Vervaeke, he says that the difference between one of the ways to differentiate between moral codes and purity codes is that one of them leads to guilt and one of them leads to shame when you break them. And Wilson specifically calls the fourth circuit the guilt circuit. And so, this is the morality. So when we break a moral rule, we feel guilt. Whereas with, breaking a purity code, it's almost like it's the first circuit, because we feel like people might ostracize us. And so we feel shame.
If you, I don't know about that distinction. Like, if you go back far enough, like even the purity code, like the sexuality stuff, like you could even make a case that it is the objectively right thing for that time period. Like, we probably all feel disgust at the idea of like incest, sibling incest resulting in reproduction kind of thing. And there's probably a good reason for that. Like, they're probably like, if you could posit an objective moral system where it's like, at this point in history, normalized incest is not the right thing for society. So you could even bring in morality. If you wanted to bring in objective morality, that's a way I could see you doing it in the system.
Yeah, you could say that. I think you're right that Wilson would say that's somewhat arbitrary because he brings up that example specifically of incest, where he talks about how Egyptian pharaohs were expected to marry their sister or something like that. Whereas, of course, today that would be disgusting.
Yeah, but it's not,
the royal
it's not
family
necessarily,
still have it.
it's not necessarily arbitrary, though, because you can make an argument that, like, maybe if you're like an ancient, pick a tribe, whatever tribe that hated homosexuality, like maybe that's a time period where they really needed a lot of reproduction. So they were like, no homosexuality, everyone heterosexual, everyone having lots of babies. Whereas today in our society, that's not what's needed. So homosexuality is more permitted.
Right. And I'm not...
families still marry their cousins because they want to keep the wealth in the family.
True. Wilson doesn't seem to be judging moralities in a moralistic way. He seems to be taking a very culturally relativist approach and talking about cultural taboos and things. I think maybe where this is confusing is that for some people, sexuality will hit the guilt circuit. And for some people, it will hit the shame circuit, or maybe neither. If you're raised in a culture where sexuality, premarital sex, homosexual sex, or whatever is you're taught that it's wrong, then you'll feel the guilt for it. But if you're not raised that way, at least I can say I've never had any guilt associated with sexuality. Like cheating would hit the guilt because of the deception and the lying, but not because of the sexuality. Maybe this is the distinction that I want to make. I think that there are certain acts that will hit anybody's guilt circuit regardless of culture.
Like what?
Like murder, rape.
Do you think Attila the Hun felt guilty for all the rape and murder?
Yeah, exactly. Clearly murderers and rapists don't feel guilt and shame about that. I mean, maybe some of them do. But clearly, the more psychopathic ones don't.
Maybe he wouldn't. I guess he would. I think he would probably feel guilt about murder if it was to someone in his tribe. He would probably feel guilt about rape if it was to somebody in his. There's also, so there's the things that we feel guilty about, and there's the things that we feel bad about. There's the acts, and then there's the beings that we consider worthy of moral consideration. And I think that Attila the Hun would have a very narrow circle of beings that he considered worthy of moral consideration.
So you're basically saying this meta structure of having a circle of people who are worthy of moral consideration, to whom brutal acts inspire guilt, that is a structure that's universal.
I think so.
It's with the exception of like sociopaths and psychopaths, as Chris pointed out.
Yes.
Yeah, I think this goes back to like tribalism, where you have this kind of in-group and you have this kind of out-group. And I guess that's all kind of on the second circuit, right?
And yeah, they interact. And then there's things within the tribe that, like moral norms within the tribe, that might help hit your guilt or might hit your shame, or both. That gets kind of blurred.
Okay, so I'm thinking, how about we have a brief discussion about the first four circuits and how they interact with each other to form like holistic systems.
Sure.
Yeah, so, sorry, go for it.
I was going to say, one thing that I was thinking about when we were talking about circuit 4 was this kind of idea of survival of the fittest and might makes right, and how oftentimes when you have people who, this sounds kind of condescending, but people who don't seem to have gone up many levels in this circuit model, they'll have some kind of a maybe rudimentary, like might makes right attitude towards morality. And it seems like maybe there's a trend there. I noticed that oftentimes people who don't have any moral considerations outside of might makes right also don't seem to have very developed circuit threes. I feel like I'm being a little bit insulting, but do you guys see that trend?
Yeah, that seems like a very overdeveloped circuit 2, being projected onto circuit 3 and 4. We're probably underdeveloped.
Well, but at the same time, I think that you can have people who use circuit 3 to dominate other people. And I think this is what the postmodernists would say. They would say, well, even, just rationality has an aspect of dominance and submission.
I think that's different, though. I think the people can do that with a moralistic philosophy that's very different from might makes right. Like that's often like this is like the master slave morality, right? Like Nietzsche talks about like the master morality, which is basically like, hey, I'm powerful, might makes right, versus the slave morality, which is like I'm weak and the powerful are evil and I'm good. And people in that slave morality can use circuit 3 to to assert a kind of dominance, but it's a very different. I think that they're different mentalities.
Yeah, I think maybe the effect that I'm talking about happens in master morality, where you say, I'm going to dominate this other person by having a better argument than them. Whereas with slave morality, it's kind of like, I'm going to, it's less circuit 3 and more circuit 2, I would say, and maybe circuit 4.
I would disagree. I think master morality is more located on circuit 2, and versus slave morality, it's very tied into circuit 3. Like I can dominate someone in an argument without being like might makes right. I can be like might does not make right. Da 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 da.
I think there are many different kinds of master moralities and slave moralities. And some of them are very circuit 3 and circuit 4 integrated. Like one example of kind of a dominant morality is maybe the morality of a king or a leader, or there's some kind of conspiracy theories about like these occultic type belief systems where you might think of yourself as more intellectually developed and more prepared and maybe like more evolved, so therefore you have the right, and also it is good for the people below you if you're running things.
Yeah,
it's not might makes right.
That's kind of like the neoliberal thing, right? Like the G7. Even aside from any conspiracy theory, but that is kind of that is just the plainly what they're doing, right? They're like, we're the powerful people. We're going to get together and we're going to decide policy for the world.
Yeah. Yeah. Or it reminds me of the concept of philosopher kings.
Yeah, that's true. That would be like a very like circuit 3 dominant master morality.
Interestingly enough, we have this kind of mixed up thing now where we hold democracy as like the prime evolved form of governance, and so many countries like in the G7 would consider it justifiable to depose the leadership of other countries in order to impose democracy. So it's like, we're better than you, we know better than you, so therefore we can overrule you in order to let you rule yourselves.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Like you get that with like a lot of like what they call like cultural imperialism too. Like the debate around like female genital mutilation is really interesting. It's a very sad issue, but basically like there's been a lot of Western intervention into female genital mutilation in like North Africa and other places, and they've like drastically reduced it. Like it's gone down by not quite an order of magnitude, but several factors. Mm-hmm. And like a lot, it's been done in the name of like improving the lives of women. But a lot of people over there, and even a lot of women, are saying like this is cultural imperialism. Like FGM is part of our culture, and we want to continue it. And you guys are like, especially a lot of educated people would say, you guys are oppressing by trying to force your cultural ideas onto these people or onto our people.
I think that's where it's really important to have a distinction between morality and things that hurt people versus cultural norms. Like, well, and I mean, maybe this isn't objective, and I know you would probably disagree with me on this, but when you're talking about something like female genital mutilation or slavery, yeah, maybe it's culturally accepted over there, but to the victim, it's not the victim's culture to want to be brutalized.
Isn't it?
No, maybe later in life. I don't know, maybe there are some voluntary FGM incidences that happen, but I think in the vast majority of cases, you're talking about a culture where one part of the society deems that it's okay to force things on other parts of the society, and you're being culturally imperialist for telling us that we can't be violent towards these people.
What about Islamic countries where women have far inferior rights to men?
I believe in women's rights. I think it's okay to criticize cultures.
Yeah, I mean, but obviously the women, it's okay for them
them
not to have rights, right? Because
Sorry,
because I think what I'm saying is that the submissive members of that society are buying into it, by and large. I mean, there are outliers here and there, but mostly they're like, yeah, we don't have rights and we shouldn't have rights. I think that's
they have less rights. They have some rights, but they have less rights.
I think it's okay for people to choose to be submissive. I wouldn't want to prevent somebody from choosing to be submissive, but the issue is that people in that society are choosing to prevent people in that society who don't want to be submissive from having rights.
I mean, it kind of doesn't get into like the concept of child grooming though. Like it's not okay. Like if a child were to be raised to like be someone's sex slave and then grew up and be like, I want to be a sex slave, and that's all they'd ever known, you probably wouldn't say that was a consensual thing.
No, so
yeah, but it gets very difficult. Like if the entire culture is like that, it's like in one instance of child grooming, you can clearly see, okay, that's far outside of the norm and it's not right. But if the whole culture is being raised in this way to be submissive, how would you even like let the idea in there, or how would you even enable the people to speak up? It gets very difficult.
yeah, it does get dicey. I think I was actually wrong to say that I think it's okay for people to want to be submissive. More accurately,
if they're in a culture where they can choose to be submissive or to not be submissive, then it's a different thing, right?
Yes.
Or maybe it's not. I guess it, yeah.
Well, I guess what I want to say is like, I think that when there's cultural grooming going on, then it's a little bit dicier and uncertain. But when you're talking about situations where there's like legal prohibitions against certain things, then I think it's justifiable to want to remove those legal prohibitions.
Is it justifiable as an outsider to come in and to compel? Like in Saudi Arabia, let's say, there's guardianship laws, right? Like a woman can't go out alone without a man. She can't travel freely in the world without a man. And she has to be fully covered. So these are pretty intense. These are pretty intense oppressive laws, right? Like, is it okay for an outsider to compel them to change, or to try to compel them to change? And if so, how?
I mean, clearly billions of people buy into the system. Clearly they don't see it as immoral.
Well, Saudi Arabia Saudi Arabia Wahhabism is like an extreme version. So I kind of make a distinction, like not all Muslims buy into Wahhabism, but
yeah,
even mainstream Islam, it does not provide equal rights for women.
Mainstream Islam doesn't provide equal rights, but if we're talking about Saudi Arabia, like the guardianship laws are, I'm not sure if they're 100% unique in the world, but I think they're the only major Islamic country that has laws like that where women can't freely.
Yeah, but going around Bangladesh, if I saw a woman on her own, it was very uncommon. So like we went to the beach to Cox's Bazar, and it was like 90% men. And if a woman was there, she was wearing the chador, I think it's called, and like full body gown. They didn't even enter the water that way. And of course, she would be there with her husband or her father, at least. So it's not necessarily illegal for a woman to be alone there, but there must be a strong, very strong cultural prohibition against it.
I think that when you're talking about like practically what's justifiable, that's where things start to get kind of maybe a bit more consequentialist. Like, would it be justifiable for the US to go to war with Saudi Arabia to get rid of the guardianship laws? I would say that I wouldn't have a clear answer to that. I would probably just say that's a bad idea. I think it would cause worse consequences to everyone, including the majority of the female victims, than if they didn't violently intervene. But is it morally justifiable to help a Saudi woman to escape, even though that's immoral in her culture? Abso-fucking-lutely.
What about like to sanction Saudi Arabia economically?
Maybe. I don't know. I don't know enough about the consequences of who the sanctions would harm, but maybe.
Here's a deeper question. What basis do we have, or do you have, to say that way is wrong and this way is better? Like, where does that come down to?
I come from a pretty libertarian philosophy. I think that individuals can say for themselves if something is being violently forced upon them. I think that they have the authority and the right to say that that is not right for me. And if you are trying to help an individual who is being violently oppressed escape that and have more self-determination, I think that that's fine.
So then it's a necessary part. So it's very focused on individuals then. So if an individual is like, or if a plurality of women in a society or majority are like, we're fine with this, then you would support that society remaining the way it is and not intervening.
I am relatively individualist. Like, maybe to clarify, I wouldn't feel morally justified to violently intervene on behalf of a woman who I saw as oppressed in her marriage if she didn't want to leave. But I do see myself as morally justified to help someone who wants to leave, and I would see myself as morally justified to try to convince a woman who I saw as oppressed that she was oppressed so that maybe she would want to leave.
So it doesn't really come down to like,
guys, can we get back on track? You guys are just having a fight between your reality tunnels.
Well, I think I'm trying to get to the bottom of Katie's reality tunnel. I'm finding it kind of interesting. What do you think, Kurt?
I'd also prefer to get back to
we can get back on track.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's a piece of my reality tunnel anyway.
Yeah, no, you guys just had different imprintings on your fourth circuit.
Well, I don't think I wasn't even talking about my imprinting. I don't think that was happening. I was.
Yeah, you're okay. Yeah, you're trying to combine your reality tunnels.
No, I was making an effort to understand Katie's reality tunnel in that situation.
Yeah, that's what I mean. That's what I'm saying.
Okay. We can get back to, what do you want to talk about, Chris?
Well, let's talk about reality tunnels and circuits instead of, we got really concrete. We got really like unmeta. Let's keep it out here where we're talking about circuits and reality tunnels.
So, okay. Can I try to fuse this? Because the reason why I feel this way about my reality tunnel is because it's a position about reality tunnels.
Yeah, I feel like we were talking about reality tunnels too. Like, I kind of feel like.
Okay, so I guess like fundamentally my position is that like people have their own reality tunnels, and what I'm not so cool with is when people are trying to say my reality tunnel is right for you. And so if you have a culture where, well, okay, I'm okay with people trying to convince each other my reality tunnel is all right for you. But if you have within a cultural reality tunnel, the majority position says my reality tunnel is correct, and so therefore I'm going to like murder people who have a different reality tunnel. Within my reality tunnel, I think it's okay to defend the people who have a different reality tunnel and just want to peacefully coexist with other people who also have different reality tunnels. And if those people want to continue to live in their like really gender role stratified reality tunnel, that's okay. I might try to like show them some of my reality tunnel, but I'm not going to violently intervene to force them into my reality tunnel.
And I would imagine if their reality tunnel was malignant, like if it was, but what if the majority of people were into the reality tunnel and they were like oppressing a minority or something like that? Would you feel justified in intervening?
I feel justified in intervening on behalf of the minority. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's part of your moral reality tunnel, is that you can also have morality about reality tunnels. So yeah, I think some people would disagree with you and say, no, you know, that person's reality tunnel is wrong, and so I must dominate them and get them to change their reality tunnel to mine.
I mean, I think that is what Katie is saying. I think it's just being couched in.
No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that if you have people who are, well, okay. I'm saying it's fine to live in your reality tunnel so long as you're not trying to violently force your reality tunnel on other people's reality tunnels. And if somebody is violently forcing, if a majority is violently oppressing their reality tunnels on a minority that are in a different reality tunnel, then I feel justified in helping the minorities with a different reality tunnel escape that situation so that they can achieve their liberated reality tunnel.
Okay.
So they can realize it.
Okay. I think that's fine. You can move on to a different topic.
Right. So you know, Wilson does talk about how some reality tunnels are preferable to other reality tunnels. He of course says that this is in his own opinion. You know, he thinks that making your reality tunnel larger and more expansive, more inclusive, more like sexier, more fun is a good thing. And presumably the opposite is a bad thing. And so I think maybe the way this relates is that, you know, in Katie's moral reality tunnel, she thinks that, you know, if she sees that other people are trapped in a reality tunnel, which is counter to their interests, she would like to expand that so that they can have an aha moment and break out of the cycle that's keeping them down.
That's true, but I want to clarify that like I would not use violent or forceful means to try to expand somebody else's reality tunnel. I don't think that would be justified.
Right.
But I think it's cool to expand your reality tunnel. Yeah, I agree with Robert Anton Wilson. In my reality tunnel, having a more open reality tunnel or
right. I mean,
broader is
so you can either influence somebody by dominating them and brainwashing them, or you can influence somebody by just exposing them to new information that they never considered. And I think all of us would agree that the second is preferable to the first.
Yeah. So it's like when we talked to Katie's father, John Kelly, about forced deprogramming versus voluntary deprogramming. So kidnapping someone and tying them up and getting them to watch a bunch of videos about how cults operate, compared to saying to them, well, I have some information you might be interested in watching, and invite them to see it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know. I mean, I'm not so sure. I think there is a difference, but I'm not so sure it's entirely categorically different. Like, it still seems like, I mean, you guys tend to be very critical of the mainstream schooling system, which is a process of asserting that a particular reality tunnel is correct, and then grooming the population to accept it. And I would imagine
right. It's a
you guys
forced
are somewhat critical of that, but it's not really imposing by force, is it? Like,
depends on the country.
Absolutely.
if there's a homeschooling system available,
everybody's forced to.
In many countries,
there are not.
In many countries, you can't homeschool. For example, in Germany and Sweden.
And in every country, you're forced to pay for it. So you wouldn't be able. You're less likely to be able to afford an alternative. Um, I don't think all public schools are so bad, though. I just want to clarify. I actually did have a good overall, like, good experience in my
Yeah,
in my education.
if you're in a sort of wealthier school district, you can have a perfectly fine public school experience. I know some people who also say that, but I would say that the vast majority of public schools are not like that.
In the world. Oh, gosh.
Especially in the world, yeah.
Yeah.
I guess it just seems like this idea that like having this like moral stricture, like thou shalt not impose a reality tunnel by force. It seems like it almost doesn't get to the root of the insight that Wilson is almost trying to get at. Like he almost seems to be part of the reason he talks about reality tunnels so much is to get us to really like question our own reality, to question whether it makes sense to even have a reality tunnel at all.
Mm.
Well, as Kurt asked earlier offline, is it possible not to have a reality tunnel?
Yeah, I don't really know. But Wilson kind of implies that you can, because he gives that example about a story of a monk and his teacher tells him, here's what you need to do to be enlightened. You're going to focus on an ox as much as you can. Every waking moment, think of the ox, how it moves and how its body is. And a few weeks later, the teacher comes to the monk and says, hey, come out here, come out of your cell. I want to show you something. And the monk says, my horns won't fit through the door. And in that moment, he was enlightened. That is, he realized how his preconceptions or how his beliefs had affected his reality in the past.
I think you can have more than one reality tunnel and move between them. Maybe that's the closest that you can get, or that I can get, to being able to not have a reality tunnel. I can't escape my own senses. You can't escape your own experience and conceptions of the world, but you can, as Robert Anton Wilson says, like, make it bigger, make it cooler, make it more diverse, make it more expansive. And I think that being able to enter into other people's or create other models on the fly, to be able to analyze situations through multiple models and multiple angles, is a good and important practice. I found myself in this conversation reverting to my default or dominant reality tunnel and arguing strongly for it. I don't want to say that that's not actually what I think, because if you ask me about my opinions on morality, those are my opinions about morality. But I am making an attempt constantly to, like, I have other frameworks as well. And I try to enter into utilitarian frameworks and try to empathize even with more authoritarians or conservatives, and then all the way to like communists and radical leftists, and try to like enter those reality tunnels to see if there's anything that I want to incorporate into my dominant one. But so far, the libertarianism has held pretty strong as a default.
So I think maybe something that we should mention is that, the way that you change your reality tunnel without somebody forcing you to change your reality tunnel involves the higher circuits, involves circuits 5 through 8, and we haven't talked about those yet. Mm-hmm. And so, as Kurt said, my horns won't fit through the door. You need to go through circuit 5 through 8 in order to have that kind of aha moment, and then you can reprogram yourself in a different reality. So yeah, I think that's maybe why the conversation got a little bit stuck, because people who haven't accessed 5 through 8 and who are only in circuit 1 through 4 are basically just stuck in whatever reality tunnel society puts them in.
Yeah. You can be stuck in the reality tunnel society puts you in. You can also be extremely stuck in the reality tunnel that you've put yourself in. You can be stuck in a countercultural reality tunnel as well.
Right, exactly. You're stuck into however you were imprinted, which there's a random component to that.
And I'm not sure it's entirely about imprinting with reality tunnels, because like Robert Anton Wilson talks about like there's one I was I think reality tunnels are more conditioning than imprinting, because he talks about like the different layers. Like there's like genetic programming, there's imprinting, there's conditioning, and there's learning. And each one is like has a weaker pull on you than the one before. So like if I learn something, then it's like much easier for me to escape whatever pull it has on me than if something is printed into my genetic code. And so I think he'd say with reality tunnels, like we're conditioned into reality tunnels, but we're not imprinted into them. Like we're imprinted into our circuits. So I think he would say, and it does seem like it's a much more commonplace experience for people to shift their reality tunnels than it is for people to change their circuit imprinting.
True. And I think that he would also add that whatever circuits you've imprinted are going to heavily influence whatever reality tunnels you have.
More than we would like to admit. Or maybe this is a good place to wrap up, because I don't know where to go without talking about 5 through 8.
Okay, audience. So basically what happened was we decided that we spent so much time on the first 4 circuits that we don't have time to do the 4 remaining higher circuits justice. So we're going to put them off and do a second episode, a bonus episode on those next 4 circuits. So stay tuned. They are very trippy. They are the trippy circuits. And we look forward to discussing them and sharing them with you very shortly.
Bye, guys.
Adios.
Peace. Dos araña.
Thank you for joining us on the Multiversity. We hope you found this episode both mind-bending and enjoyable.
We can be found all over the social media space and at multiversitypodcast.com.
If you like this content, give us a like, comment, follow, share, or support us on Patreon.
Catch you on the flip side.